welcome everyone. A live Blueprint podcast. Always excited to do these kinds of things. As I said, we've been doing this show for 3 seasons now, and this is our 4th season where we're walking through MITRE's 11 strategies of a world-class cybersecurity operations center. I'm the host of the podcast and of the Blue Team Summit, of course, John Hubbard, and very, very excited to be here with all 3 of our authors. So let's get into some quick introductions here. Let me pass it over. We can start with Kat. If you could just give the audience a quick kind of intro to who you are and where you work and all that kind of stuff. And I'll say before anyone starts real quick, even though we all have kind of day jobs and work for a given company, this is one of those, we are not necessarily speaking on behalf of our company type panels. So just get that out of the way. All right, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kathryn Knerler, and I'm really happy to be here. And I have been working for MITRE for about 12 years at this point. I've been in the cybersecurity field for about 30 years now, and just feel like this is my time to start giving back and helping other people move along their careers and journeys at this point.
Fantastic. Ingrid?
Ingrid Parker. I am currently with Red Canary as the Senior Manager of Threat Hunting. Way back when I was an art major in school, and then I transitioned over to system administration when I was in the Army, and then eventually found my way into cyber. So I love talking about kind of those career paths and how people can move into this field, maybe if you're coming from a non-traditional background. And I also spent in between there 11 years at MITRE myself, and that's where I was when we were writing the book.
Fantastic. And Carson, over to you.
Hey, folks. Carson Zimmerman. I'm currently an investigations lead at Microsoft. I spend all day answering questions with data. Before that, for a very long time, I was also with MITRE working in security operations. And just a little bit with these 2 other fine individuals present today. I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. So you've all worked kind of together in MITRE. It's kind of the common thread, right? And there's this kind of a history of work together and this book and everything. For this conversation, for others who may not be familiar with the book or otherwise, I want to give everyone a little bit of history of where this all came from. So Carson, could you give us like a quick kind of background on maybe the first edition of the book, and then bring us up to the present where we are now with the newly released edition?
Sure. Picture it, 2010. I had read a number of materials, including those by First and CertCC and Richard Beeklick and others that described, security operations, computer security incident response team, CSIRTs. But I didn't see as much on this kind of conversation, and I didn't see as much consensus in the industry as I would have liked. And I said, someone should write more of this down. And initially I thought I was actually going to do a set of frequently asked questions. And you can imagine it like a solar system forming out of dust and gases. And eventually clumps start coming together, and eventually you have a whole solar system. And that's how 10 strategies came to be. Is I had many people around me, and one person was like, oh, you should turn this into the 10 commandments of C&D. And I said, ooh, that's an interesting idea. And that's actually how we got 10. And it was almost by an accident. Is me and a bunch of other people I worked with at MITRE, we kept getting in these same conversations of like, how much data do I need? And, how many analysts do I need? And like, how do I do this? And how do we do that? I'm like, man, someone should write this down. So, that's how the first edition came about. And initially we thought we were only going to give it out, to, a couple hundred people. And then it went out and it grossly exceeded our expectations. And I'm like, I guess people want to hear more about this. And people immediately started saying, when are you going to do a second edition? I said, oh my God, I just got done writing a book. Give me a break. Because writing a book, folks, takes about 1,000 hours. And this one did too. And then, a number of years go by, and, some of us go in different directions. And then, we talked, MITRE was like, hey, let's do a second edition. And this time around, it was great to have Ingrid and Kathryn there. And it was an interesting and amazing and lively process as we moved through what's new, what's different, how has our thinking changed, what new things do we need to put in the book. Spoiler alert, it wasn't just one new strategy. And how do we talk things about some of this topic today differently than we did 10 years ago?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to it. I knew Carson when he was writing the first version. I was really excited and wanted to help him out with it. Just really wanted to. What I'd like to say about the book is we were getting questions about how do I get started in security operations? What are the things that I need to know to not only start, but what are all the things? What do I need to know? What are the functions? What are the high level things, as well as what are the technical things people have to learn? So I think Carson did a really nice job in that first edition of laying out the groundwork for what are those things. And so our next version, version 2 that we're talking about today, I think that one has modernized it, brought it up to speed. I mean, cybersecurity changes every year. You have to keep up with this stuff. So there were a lot of changes. And I mean, as well as there are a lot of changes since we wrote the book at this point, right? So.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I
for
absolutely
sure.
want to note, the book is free. So this is not an advertisement for anything you have to put dollars down for. You can go directly to the link that I think John has put into Slack. You can go grab that PDF. Well, there are print and ebook versions available this time on most of the major booksellers, and there is a cost there. None of us or MITRE makes any money off of that. Like, it's literally the cost of paper is what that charges for. But we really wanted this to be accessible to that person who is just moving into cybersecurity. Maybe they're in school, maybe they're trying to do a career transition. We didn't want there to be a cost associated with this. So it is there, it's available, it's a free resource. So not a sales pitch for anything to sell.
We don't make a dime.
And that's one of the things I love about this, right? It's such an amazing just compendium of knowledge. It's like hundreds and hundreds of pages, and anyone can just go grab it and get some, absolutely outstanding knowledge out of that. That's going to get them jump started and that help their team out a lot. I know, having written some of my own, coursewares and books and stuff myself, like writing is a long, arduous process, right? And it takes forever to go from like, it's an idea to like map out the concepts to, okay, I have a draft and check it, finally release it. One of the things I know that I'm sure people are interested in is from when this was finalized, which was probably not all that long ago, in an industry that moves very, very quickly. Is there anything that now, if you had a chance to like scribble in a few more things in the notes, that any of you would love to like, oh, I wish I could include that now? Kick it off there.
I so want identity and SaaS in the book. Like, that is just, even as we were finishing it up, because it was put out March of last year, that was something that really was on people's horizons and that was becoming really important. But it's, to me, it's one of the most glaring things that isn't in the book that I wish was there. And should we ever get motivated to do a third edition, assuming that we have not moved on even past that, would be something I would want to see.
What part of
and just to build on that just a little bit, what Ingrid is saying, the identities, that association of identities with resources and data has become really, really hot, including with security operations. So being able to change how you do your security monitoring, where you focus your identity stuff.
And then Carson, I didn't know if you had anything beyond that, because I was going to ask about that, but I didn't want to lose the ideas of what we might add to the book.
I mean, finishing the book was kind of challenging because we all had more to say, and we could have been there for probably another 452 pages. And it was sort of, and Ingrid was like, we just need to finish, right? Finish. And that was fun. We're never gonna end piling on here. There's no question. Identity and cloud are two big growth areas right now. I think as every new technology pops up, that's going to be another section we put in the book. I think I would take this opportunity to point out one of the principles we had in what we did and didn't say in the book was based on our own experiences. If it was stuff where we didn't feel like there either was consensus or opportunities where we put our hands on and actively participated, we generally didn't talk about it. So I'll pick a random thing. I think we used the acronym XDR once in the book, and everyone's saying XDR right now. And it would be interesting to say in probably 2 years or so, once we've gained more consensus than today, what does that look like? And what do we have different to say about XDR compared to SIEM or any of the other censoring capabilities we've had so far? So I think, abstractly, we can say there will be an endless march of new tech that would go in there. Everyone's talking about large language models, generative, blah, 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 AI, pick a buzzword, put it here right now. I'm sure that would pop up in the future. I still have complicated feelings about that as well.
And I was definitely going to ask about AI because I'm sure that question is going to pop up. Actually, it already did in the top of the list. So we'll hit that in just a second. The first thing I wanted to get back around to, Ingrid, you had mentioned identity. Can you say a little bit more about if you were to add identity into the book, like what chapter, is there like one portion of it that you're thinking like, oh, I need to have mentioned that in there? Like where would it naturally fit?
I think if we weren't going to rearrange or move on to 12 strategies, we'd probably think about it from the data source perspective. Mm-hmm. And really, how do you get the logs on that information? How do you integrate it with the other information that you have coming in? Identity on its own is great, but identity with, hey, you accessed this application and you were at this location when you did it and it was this time. I mean, a lot of those behavioral things, they're really, really hard. But it really is identity plus the other data that you can bring in is where you're going to find a sweet spot.
Is there something about how we do identity now versus just maybe 2 or 3 years ago where there's like maybe additional, I don't know, opportunities, tooling? What's been the fundamental shift that kind of, made it to the point where you're like, oh, identity, that's definitely the thing that's happened in the recent past?
Yeah. I mentioned identity with SaaS, applications as a service, and it really is seeing how many companies are shifting to the point where they may not even own the applications that they're running. And so really, you're not getting the same logs from that information. You don't have them on premise. You don't have them in the cloud. Like you just don't have the same monitoring, and identity and then your configuration management are really the ways that you're looking at those applications to figure out what's happening in that space. And so for me, it's been less that the way you could monitor identity has changed, although certainly we've got a lot of identity brokers now that you can work with. It's really about what you need to do with that data in order to protect your environment, especially newer organizations that are maybe not as tied to legacy software, legacy applications. If you're a smaller startup organization, probably most of your applications are not going to be things that you manage yourself. And so that's really where you've got to start thinking about, okay, how else do I look at this that's a little bit different than traditional network and endpoint monitoring?
And is that a shift that was largely, I would say, maybe not impacted, but fast forwarded by 2020 and, yep. And the whole kind of everyone went home and started working remotely and we push it all to the cloud? Absolutely.
I can imagine that transition would have been a lot slower if we hadn't had that event going on. And suddenly all of these companies do not have an option on their IT roadmap. Their option was given to them.
Yep.
I'll throw in a few things there. I think on the identity front, one of them is, if I had to tease this out, parse this out, pun intended, is, there's the topic of identity federation, especially when you're in multi-cloud. And like so many people I talk to, they're going multi-cloud and they don't have a choice. It's just what's happening to them. So managing the federated identities amongst identities that don't want to federate and what that looks like, and doing all those translations, and then being effective in responding in the identity layer, which in many cases, we're thinking less about IPs and, all in the olden days, people like just block this class A. It's like, okay, maybe not. And we're not talking about that nearly as much anymore, thank goodness. And we're very much thinking about the identity layer. And I was literally having this conversation last week with a couple people at First in Montreal. Great conference, by the way. When we talk about, if we want to block an identity, it's not just about rolling a password, though that may be important. And it's not just about stopping token issuance, so that's important. And it's not just about expiring existing tokens, so that's more important. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a bunch of nuance here that a lot of people are going to be forced to really learn really quickly as we operate at this kind of plane.
Yeah, and I can throw down a couple things that I've been learning in my circles that we have to pay more attention to that maybe we didn't in the past as security operations folks. We have different kinds of identity-based access, right? So role-based and attribute-based. So we're starting to put a lot more emphasis in design on what are the attributes around a persona or an identity, right? So if I live in, Kentucky and I'm accessing something in California and I shouldn't be, we have a lot more granularity available to us in the software to be able to differentiate where we are. What that means to a security operations organization is that now you have other things that you can look at for anomalies, for, wait a minute, this isn't right. This group is over here and they're coming from over here. And so it just gives you more to log, more to pull in for data, as Ingrid was mentioning. And also for federation, it helps you with how do you broker across all these different kinds of fabrics, say cloud fabrics versus legacy data and all of that, as Carson was mentioning.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm always talking about, and ranting and raving about detection engineering and things like that, is like you need fields that are going to have some kind of relevant correlation to the contents is going to indicate whether it's likely good, likely bad, right? And with identity and with that granularity, it brings that capability, but it also brings this like enormous, okay, now we have a lot more data. What if it actually matters? What if it is worth actually collecting? And that's one of the things we get into in the podcast. So we won't get into that necessarily here. But I mean, the short question I wanted to ask as a follow-on to that is there any particular attribute or new capability, that you're thinking about when you say that kind of thing, like that gold nugget that we didn't have before in terms of attributes?
Well, yeah. So tapping into things like SAML, if you've heard about, these token languages that you're able to, pad up that go with an identity. I don't think as a security operations person, I even knew that this stuff existed a couple years ago. And what I'm finding is there's an entire wealth of how identities are passed from one place to another. What are the attributes that are important to pass along? So SAML is what I was talking about. SAML, ZACML, all these different kinds of languages that have been there for many, many years, 2000s, right? But we didn't really tap into them as security operations. It's now, a wealth of information, maybe too much, right?
Yeah, it's always difficult, especially with new data sources that are just high volume in terms of fields. And sometimes when they're not documented very well on top of it, you're just like, I know there's something good here, but where is it, right? So one of the other things I wanted to kind of transition into talking about, that we already brought up, and I know this is going to be an interesting topic to a lot of people, is the AI factor in everything, everywhere, all of a sudden, right? We have one question in the chat room I want to get to in just a second, but I want to start with a little bit more of a general thing. Is there any kind of thought that you all have? I'd love to kind of hear just everyone's opinion on what AI is going to do for cyber defenders in a general sense. Make the job easier, harder, less necessary, all the above? Go for it.
All right, I'll start. So I want to bifurcate this, and then you can stop me into two pieces. One of them is, AI and all of the applications, services, data, APIs, etc., that will be stood up by our customers, our constituents, that we'll need to go understand and defend. And then there's the branch of this of, what stuff is going to help us do our jobs better. And I would like to take this opportunity to point out something that I've seen happen many times in the time I've been doing security operations. And that is, there'll be some tool, usually a detective capability, that has problems. And then someone will say, this technology is dead. IDS is an example. SIM is an example. They'll say, oh, IDS is dead. IDS has been dead for 20 years, according to some pundits, yet people are still buying sensors. So this does not compute. So what I'd like to point out is, some people are already saying, oh, we won't need people anymore. I take a different approach. You can see our history is one where you bring more automation to bear to both increase efficiency and effectiveness. and that enables you to take on more things that you didn't have time before. I view AI, and specifically these large language models, as following a similar pattern. And what's interesting is it's going to move really fast, and it's going to be difficult to predict where we're even going to be in, I think, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah,
I will be the first to raise my hand and say, I am not, like, I wouldn't put the expert title on me. I wouldn't even put the moderate user of AI at this point, like just starting to personally explore it. And I think I can imagine that's where a lot of people are, but where I've started to see some impacts, and I think this dovetails off what Carson was saying, like there's not just a single use case for this. You have to think across both what the attackers are doing, what defenders are doing, how we use it programmatically. Recently we had a job posting and we got a whole bunch of resumes, and we're like, how many of these had AI generated cover letters to them? We ask a series of questions when people are applying to us, and we're like, what is the likelihood that somebody actually just typed this into one of the systems to get a response? So we actually did testing prior to putting those questions out to see what the major, like ChatGPT, everything else would do. And one of our folks, did a great job going in and testing them to make sure that we were unlikely to get an AI generated response to our questions. But you look at some of these cover letters and you see a real difference between how people write their resume, how people answer the questions, and what their cover letter looks like. And their cover letter is elegant and beautiful and, has this kind of level of writing to it. And that was different than how they did other things. And so I would not have wondered about this 3 years ago. Might still be somebody out there that could do it. But at this point, it's like you're questioning everything that's coming in. And certainly people are still like the most important part of a SOC, and you're going to have to go through interviews and everything else. And I would imagine that, you would quickly be able to uncover if somebody was not completely genuine in terms of how they were doing things. But then we also ask ourselves a question of, is that a bad thing? If you are using AI to enable you to put together a stronger cover letter, just like you'd use it to write code or you use it for something else, is that necessarily a bad thing? So it'll be interesting, I think, as that continues to go, to see how we use it in terms of our writing styles, presentations, maybe, how we talk to executives, how we synthesize information. I can imagine that there's going to be a lot of how can we use our data sets to enable different kinds of findings for what we're doing. We, where I am right now, because we're an MDR, we have a lot of different customers. We get lots of different questions, and we're investigating, okay, how do we put that information together in a way that makes it easier for customers to come in and ask questions? There's certainly the data analysis part. How do you do on top of that? And then we start thinking about the adversary and saying, okay, are they able to code faster? Are they able to change, their modules? Are they able to, pivot in a different way than they did before? So far, at least what I've observed is that while you see some of this, it has not fundamentally changed from the speed at which particular adversary groups or types of malware have changed. But that's definitely something to keep an eye on as we move forward, because it's hard. I think somebody had commented in one of the channels about how hard it is to keep up with detections in cloud and infrastructure and everything else. I'm like, well, it's not going to get better. But that's where we have the opportunity to use it as well. So I just think there's so many different use cases that we have to start breaking those apart for people and not just say AI. We have to think about, okay, for what application, for what purpose, how are you going to use it? And how are you going to evolve it with what you're trying to do in a way that your team can actually use it, rather than it just being this mythical thing that's going to stand over here.
I agree. And I guess what I would say to add to all of this is I like going to specifics of how can I use it and how am I seeing it being used today. One really promising area, I think, and I'm not an expert either, by the way, in AI, but one area is on this concept of modeling and simulation. So digital twins, if you've seen those out there in the world, it's news and ways of doing things. A digital twin is essentially a copy of your system or your network. It can be a digital twin of anything, actually. But in this case, for security operations, what I'm thinking of it in terms of is our networking, our cloud environments, so that you can look at how to model and how to do detections. You can use AI to help you design what kinds of detections that you want on your networks, which ones would be most effective. Also, you can pull in the most recent attacks or the most prevalent attacks that we see out there and go ahead and have AI and other tools help you to make suggestions, make recommendations. So maybe I need these kinds of sensors. Maybe I need to tweak something over in another area. Maybe one area of my network's being attacked all the time, so I should be putting more forces over there. So we can use AI to augment what we're already doing. What I sincerely hope doesn't happen, and I think what a lot of the experts in AI are worried about, is that we try to replace thinking, especially critical thinking and creative thinking, with AI. And that is looking like it's going to be possible in the next, I don't know, 5 years. They were saying like 20 years. Now they're saying more like 5. If you talk to the Google of CEO, or not CEO, but one of the CTO, the guy who invented it. But anyway, it's really important as this comes along that we don't replace our thought, that we make sure we have our experts and we make sure that we're using it to augment what we do today.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, I agree with everything you all said. And the way I kind of think about it is we're standing like on this precipice of like, it's almost as if someone was like, here's the internet. Now, what are you going to do with it? It's like, I have no idea. Like, this was so fundamentally different from the way things existed and were before that like, it's hard to even see the opportunities there. Right. But we have seen a lot of demonstrations of specific use cases. Right. So I think breaking it down into specific conversations is definitely the way to go about it. I know a lot of my friends, working for companies, they're implementing different AI like policies about what can and cannot be used for and when it can be used and all that. We've all probably heard of that example of, I think it was Samsung, where I think it was engineers had put something into it and they're like, oh crap, did we just, feed company proprietary data into the AI model? And, those kind of worries are a whole different thing, right? But we have seen some very interesting and compelling kind of defensive use cases. And from my, usage of it, which is really just me buying access to GPT Plus and, using for a little bit, the two most useful activities I've found is kind of generating ideas, that like creative, just divergent thinking, coming up with a list of options. It's great at that. And then also the more specific tasks of like, here's some code, deobfuscate it for me. Here's something, I want it just figured out, summarize it, write it. I had it write playbooks for me once just to see if that would work, right? I said like, you were a SOC analyst trying to come up with a phishing incident response playbook, right? Write me out the steps that are the most important things to make sure I cover whatever it is. And I would encourage, right, anyone in the audience that has not actually gone into Chat GPT or any Bard, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's time, right? Get in there and try it out. If you have not done this yet, the hype is real. You should definitely go in and start throwing some questions at it. You don't want to be behind the curve on prompt engineering and all of that. So to get to one of the questions from the audience here, David Jones asked, with AI significantly speeding up developers of all types, what sort of attacks do you see increasing in the next few months? And what are you recommending that organizations do about it that's different from advice to the past? So I would also kind of tweak that a little bit to say, is there any AI fueled attack path that's going to get easier, better, that maybe you have seen as well?
I go back to phishing. I mean, because that is still the primary way that people get into, initial access. And, as the quality of those emails continues to improve, I guess improves the right term for what the adversary is doing. If they get rid of some of those markers, some of the language barriers, some of the content, if they can make it sound, the more they can make it sound official, the more likely a user is to click on that link. And so I think that's one of the easiest ways that I could imagine AI coming into play from an adversary perspective. And Carson, I started talking over you. What were you guys saying?
It's cool. I was going to say that was going to be one of my two answers. The other thing to be thinking about is one of information leakage. Any of these models are only good as the data that they feed on. That's one thing we always have to consider. As you kind of hinted at, John, one of the things to be aware of here is someone goes into in any of these large language models, they put a prompt in and they get an answer that gives them information they didn't expect, and or the owners of the model didn't want them to have. We've already seen this. And as those grow, we should be thoughtful about that.
Yeah. I'm a little gloom and doom on this one, to that question. I'm scared actually, because I think we just lowered the barrier to entry for all kinds of hacking for groups and people. And I think it's going to be easier, just like you can ask for a playbook to be created. You can ask for, give me a hack that will take out, I don't know, pick out AWS, pick out, your vendor of choice, right? That's what scares me.
Yeah, I think that it has absolutely raised the bar on both sides. The question is, which side's bar got higher, right? Did it help defenders? Did it help attackers more? I don't even know how you would go about measuring that sort of thing, but that's kind of the approach or the impression I'm getting when I look at some of this stuff. Because yeah, if you can feed it code and say, tell me where the exploit is, and I'm sure that there's people doing that. I think I've already seen that actually. Guaranteed that kind of thing is going on. That's going to make exploit development faster. But then we turn around and we say, give me the patch for the code, right? And then maybe we can speed that part up too. So it's an interesting kind of place to be with this sort of capability just handed to both sides out of nowhere. And hard to know where that's going to go. So I guess we'll have to see and keep an eye on that. One of the other questions I saw pop up in the chat here. So Renee asks, how can we effectively keep up with detection in the cloud as an IaaS platform as a service? We have a hard time to keep our detection relevant in a constantly changing environment such as AWS. Any thoughts on detection engineering and keeping it up to date as much as possible?
I'll take a first shot at this. This point, Renee, inspired a SANS talk I gave a year or two ago. And one of the major tenets of my talk was if a detection or brand of detections that you want are commoditized, don't ride them, buy them or download them. If they're, be it commercial or open source respectively. I myself, and I've worked with many people who have spent many hundreds of hours, thousands of hours collecting OS telemetry and then writing a bajillion detections for OS telemetry. And I would argue today you're better off, buying or constructing an EDR to do that because it's been commoditized. So part of my answer here is, if you have any influence on the cloud purchases your constituency engages in, I guarantee you that many you won't, but for the ones that you do, driving them toward cloud solutions that have any of that stuff baked in might give you a running start, or failing that, a really good telemetry stream that you can capitalize. So my message is, buy or download or open source your way out of what's commoditized. You can focus on these interesting things.
Any thoughts on if we're commoditizing detection, does that mean the attackers know what we can detect and then just right around it?
Absolutely. We had a talk on that today, right? Yep. So that's why I would flip that around and say that's why we're always trying to cover the entire kill chain. We're trying to be thoughtful about which attack tiles we cover. That's why we have proactive hunt and not just alerting.
Also, just to add to that, we have tried to combine like EDR, host-based, and memory. All the things that come with some of these products that are commoditized is making sure you're looking at active memory, making sure you're looking at where you wouldn't always look, across the network. Network detection has become a little bit downplayed as EDR has risen up, and we talk about that a little bit in the book. So it's covering your bases across the different kinds of things that you have access to. So maybe you didn't detect it in one place, but maybe it shows up somewhere else.
Yeah, and I think emphasizing that idea of the full life cycle of an attack and the intelligence that can support that, and really acknowledging that you don't want to just pick something up when it already becomes ransomware. Like, you want to be looking, as early in the chain as you can, but you still need to look late in the chain in case you've missed it. You want to be thinking about what the adversary groups are that you want to be, tracking and keeping an eye on, which ones do actually use cloud. If that's your particular concern, what are the techniques that they tend to use, keep up with MITRE attack and figure out kind of, what's changing in the cloud environment there. What did they've put in, for the different tiles that Carson was talking about. Actually, I will address real quick. I saw somebody's comment about, are MITRE and attack the same thing? MITRE is a federally funded research and development center. It's a parent company that runs a bunch of these FFRDCs. Attack is a knowledge base that actually, talks about how adversaries perform certain actions. So it is a product, not the term that team will use, but it is a thing that MITRE has developed and put out. So they are different, very different things, but that you hear MITRE Attack because that's the formal trademark for Attack. So just to address that question real quick.
Perfect. So you had mentioned one thing that I know I run into a question on a lot, detecting stuff earlier on in the chain. In general, can we say that there's any approach that you all take when it comes to everyone's scared of ransomware and we all would love to catch it early, but how do we know what ransomware looks like early on in the chain as compared to all the other stuff we heard about this morning, commodity malware, those kind of things? Any kind of general approach and hints you can give to people to pick that stuff out real fast?
We often refer to it as ransomware precursors, that there are certain pieces of code, certain pieces of malware that are more likely to be known and used by the groups that are then going to result in malware. And I know Steph Rand talked about some of those earlier, but really going in and this is where threat intelligence can help. And again, because a lot of people have mapped hey, if you see, Qbot, you should be aware that sometimes that leads on to something else. If you see Cobalt Strike, you should start to panic a little bit more because now you've got a toolkit on your environment that allows the adversary to do a lot of different things. And then you get to the, by the time you actually see the ransomware note, it unfortunately is a very, very bad day for your organization. So definitely going in and searching for those things known as ransomware precursors. It's not everything. Obviously, adversaries change their agendas all the time, but that's one of the things of note is that although there's a lot of changes, there's a lot of things that stay the same. A lot of this is commoditized where you have initial access brokers that are doing one thing, and then you have the people who actually come in and do the exploits, and then you have the people who do the ransomware and their toolkits, and they are shared out and sold and run by individuals or organizations over and over again, and they're just looking for the easy way in. So many of the attacks that we see are still not necessarily as tailored to your organization if they don't have to be. And so there's a lot that you can discover just by understanding the chain and the different adversaries and what tools they use.
Gotcha.
But I'd like to double down on one of the things that Ingrid just said. When people approach cybersecurity new, they usually think about an attack being conducted end-to-end by the same adversary. And Ingrid pointed out something that a lot of people should remember and can unfortunately lead to analytic bias. We may be bringing, even when we're not thinking about it, is the people who get presence on your network are not necessarily the people who are leveraging that presence. In fact, often they're not. And guess what, Fortune 500s, it is most likely that at any given time, one of your users' credentials are being sold on the dark web. So that's one way to think about this problem and think about how those credentials may spend a long time on that marketplace before they're used.
Perfect. So one of the things that just came up in the chat room here that I think kind of matches well with this question from Dan on, as a practical matter in the real world, how does threat hunting blend with red teaming and SOC operations generally? And then there's, for example, are SOC operators doing threat hunting on the side? Is it outside contractors? Are the red teams attempting to bypass the deceived threat actors in an adversarial way so each try to win? Just curious how those kind of functions work together in the typical kind of real world team is what Dan is looking for. Any thoughts on that?
I'm so glad that one came up because that's exactly what I was thinking about with the question on detection. Threat hunting can help you up your detection game, right? Because they're coming up with things that are tailored to your environment. You want bespoke kinds of detection that you can have that's tailored to your environment and based on what's normal for you. Threat hunters can help with that picture quite a bit, actually, because they're actually looking for stuff. So they'll come along, they're looking for adversaries in the network. So they'll come along usually to the detection folks and say, hey, can you put a detection in looking for these things, XYZ, which wasn't previously looked for. So yeah, there's this whole thing, red teaming, blue teaming, purple teaming, all those teamings. Threat hunting, I think out of all of that's probably one of the more valuable ways to do it because they're actually proactively looking for adversaries. Red teaming is useful usually to get attention and to say, hey, see, we can still get in. Unless you build a cycle where you have a blue team and a red team, and this is talking about bigger security operations kinds of organizations, right? Where you have the luxury to be able to have blue teams and red teams and all of these folks going back and forth. Blue teams are really great to help keep up the skills of defending. So it gets kind of boring if you're just constantly just looking at, false alerts and things that look normal. So red teamers and blue teamers together can kind of keep it exciting and keep the attacks more modern. But threat hunting to me, and I might be biased on that one, I actually like the threat hunting groups because they're more of a learning and creative kind of function in my experience. And so I kind of go there first.
And I want to build a little bit on the first question that came up, which is, how do SOC operators do threat hunting? Is it a side gig? Is it something you do specifically? A lot of that depends on the size of your team and how many alerts are you getting and how is it tuned and what do you need to be looking for? And, if you have a lot of really great detections already in place and they're really well tuned, then your team might have the time to go do hunting as something separate. If you've got a lot of noise and you're coming on, getting these alerts all the time, you might need to think about continue to tune your detections first, and then think about hunting as a separate role. It is really hard. I know on my team right now, like you'll be dealing with an alert, you'll be looking at something and it's like, okay, but I want to go back and finish this hunt. And you start this hunt and it's like, oh, I need 2 or 3 or 4 hours or a day to really get in the mindset for that. Oh, wait, a ticket came up, an alert popped up. So they're very different speeds that they need to occur. And you need to make sure that you're carving out the time so that if you're doing hunting, you can do it and you can be sustained in that and you can get to not finish, but a good stopping point without the constant having your alerts come up. But we also recognize that alerts are kind of the bread and butter of a SOC. And so you need to make sure that those are being taken care of as well. So there's a lot of different ways I've seen this work. Everything from, hey, you've got a morning to do this and an afternoon to do this. It's a rotating week schedule to people that are specifically assigned to the different roles. And there's pros and cons to all of those just depending on your organization. But as Kathryn was saying, like hunting is a very creative field. And there are people who are going to be really excited and enthused about that. And so trying to figure out how you can get that into your SOC in some way and get people engaged, just making sure you've got the time set aside. It's not just a, do it when you can type of thing.
I have a couple thoughts to add. One of the things I like seeing in the SOC is where they can get their investigators, their responders, their analysts into an on-call rotation that enables them to have time where they're very deliberately not getting new cases and not looking at the queue. To Ingrid's point, one of the things I would point out when we think about red teams getting to part of this question, people come to this with their own thoughts about red teams. When some people say red team, some people think a team shows up, hired externally, they do their test for 2 weeks and then they leave. And it's not interactive at all. And then there are people who think about red teams in terms of they're there to make blue better. They don't have as nearly as strong a timeline. They have a focus area, and it smells a whole lot more like mess around and find out. And I would argue that there's a time and place for both. And, you were doing, you were harnessing red teaming most effectively when you have the timing and resourcing to pursue both approaches for red teams. We could have a whole separate talk on purple teams, but I don't know if we've got time for that today.
I want to hit on one more thing from
the. Oh, go ahead, Ingrid.
No, please, Kathryn.
Well, it's a different subject. I wanted to tackle a quick question in the chat there.
I was going to do the same thing. Let me finish mine because it's on threat hunting, which is just to say, somebody asked about, can threat hunting lead to detection engineering? And I think when you're thinking about all of these different groups, you're thinking about different outcomes. And it's really, you're not doing them because you happen to like red versus purple versus the name threat hunting. You're doing it because you want to get to different outcomes. And so when you think about threat hunting, your outcomes can be new detections. Your outcomes can be you found an actual adversary in your environment. Your outcome could be, we didn't find anything, so now we're giving our CISO assurance that that new vulnerability has not impacted us yet. It could be, hey, we didn't find what we thought we were looking for, but we've noticed that this is something that we have going on in our environment that is not a great security practice. So we're going to pass that on to our IT teams. Like, there's a lot of different outcomes that can come from threat hunting, and absolutely new detections is one of those outcomes. Kathryn.
Yeah, so I wanted to jump back to AI for a minute. I don't know how to tie that to threat hunting, but I bet there is a tie there somehow. Someone had asked about AI playing an increasing role now. How will it fit into the MITRE attack framework and everything else, the TTPs and everything else? There is something called MITRE Atlas. It's already out there, and there's entire organizations looking at how AI fits into both attacks and, you know, the bifurcation we talked about and detection. So just want to answer that quickly.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that before, so definitely going to check that out. Yeah, I agree 100% with all that stuff. The other thing I wanted to add immediately to that as well is when you find things other than adversaries, when you're threat hunting, also write those things down, right? Your metrics should be not only what did I find or not find, but how many things did I fix? How many vulnerabilities did I find? How many acceptable use policy, violations would I run into? There's a whole bunch of stuff, and all of that is valuable. So that would be kind of my tip on that, is no matter what the value was, whether it's attackers or whether it's something else, right? Write that stuff down and use that as justification to continue your threat hunting activity. One thing I wanted to ask, where does threat hunting in your mind fall in terms of priorities as an activity for a SOC? Is that something you get to as quickly as you form a SOC, or is that like a medium ground kind of thing?
Well, I think I've already expressed my opinion. I think it's highly important. I think it really is right up there with right after incident response in this day and age, especially with all these new AI kinds of things that are starting to happen. I think we're going to see some attacks. So I think the threat hunting increases in the value and the need for it.
Yeah. This is an interesting one. And the reason why I make that remark is we could probably very easily take the stance that, you should do a bunch of other basic things before you think about doing hunting. And being absolutist about that can close off opportunities for the SOC to put resources in a direction that may become a very big deal very quickly for the SOC and its constituency. So, that's one of the things I want to think about. One of the other points I'll make here is, a really good threat hunt, maybe by a managed provider, might lead to the creation of a SOC, or might be a precipitating event where they're like, oh my God, look at this giant adversary, this giant infection we found. So to say, you must do X, Y, Z before you even think about it, is probably being too absolutist, too black and white. And the other point I'll make is, more and more people are doing this as their regular cadence, and foreshadowing my talk tomorrow. No matter how big or old you are, no matter how big or small you are, how new or old your SOC is, you want to be thinking about constantly improving the efficiency of your routine stuff so you can make time for things like hunting.
Gotcha. Perfect.
I think if there was anything I would say to think about before you jump into the hunting, it really is your data. What data are you bringing in? How is it being stored? How is it being normalized? You can hunt in anything. It's just how painful it's going to be. And if you have to make a trade-off between some engineering resources and some hunting resources, it's worth looking into whether spending a little bit of time doing some of the background engineering and getting the right data in the right formats would make hunting exponentially easier for you going forward. So would offer that consideration.
I feel that. I think Carson did. Me and him both start laughing when you say that. Yeah. If your threat hunt for 8 hours is 7 hours of cleaning your data and 1 hour of hunting, that's a good sign that you might want to go back to the data.
There's one other point I forgot to make, and I've seen this pop up is in a SOC where you have dedicated hunting roles. One thing to control for or deal with is in any role in a SOC that does not have an on-call rotation or an on-call component, those people who are not in that on-call rotation can feel very important and feel like they're a higher form of life than the other part of the SOC, and that they've graduated past this doldrum of being on call. And we should be very thoughtful about the behaviors and perceptions around that.
Yeah, Absolutely. I want to do a gear shift here. One question came up and I wanted to hit this anyway. So now is probably as good a time as anyway. We still got 15 minutes or so. Supply chain attacks, right? Another threat that's big in the news. We're hearing more and more and more about it. We've got a specific question here that I'll hit in a second, but I want to ask the more general question first. Why do you think that we're either seeing or at least hearing more about supply chain attacks now than maybe we had 5 years ago?
So I'll answer generally to start with. Supply chain is such a giant topic. I mean, it's hard to know even where to start. I mean, we've been talking, there are millions, billions of lines of code etched into these little chips that are in our computers already. So, that's one aspect of supply chain. Software and where we get it, it's often created all over the world by different people, paid or not paid. So it's a super, super difficult question to get around. And I always have to go back to what are the goals of what you're trying to do? Because I've been asked a lot, like, how do we do detections for supply chain? It's like, well, which part of the supply chain do we want to tackle first, right? If you have industrial control systems, ICS, perhaps that takes a different kind of approach, maybe an important approach that we look at. How do we look at supply chain attacks and look for those? Doing detects for supply chain, super complicated. So that's my answer. It's not a good answer, but that's really where I am on it.
I mean, that's the perfect start off to this, right? Because where I wanted to go with that is like, and I'm not even sure this term works here, but we're going to try our best. The average SOC when it comes to looking at supply chain attacks, right? What might that sort of thing, what's the intersection with the average SOC and considering and worrying about supply chain attacks?
Yeah,
John, I feel like you've inspired any of us to do a whole new talk for SANS for 2024. We could spend an hour on this and we'd be barely scratching the surface. Ingrid's got feelings.
I have feelings. I have thoughts. I know that there are a number of great supply chain resources out there by folks at MITRE who we have gotten to work with. Like, they are absolutely the experts in this field, and please go read their papers and the information that they put out on there and the work that they're doing with software bill of materials and things that the government itself can do, because this is a much bigger problem than an individual organization. And it really is, how do industries and how do governments come together to address what software looks like going forward in a way where we can sustainably understand what is actually in components. And then tying that back to what do the individual SOCs do, one of the biggest things I would recommend is just making sure that you actually have your software inventory and you know what's running in your environment. You may not know all the components that are in it, but even for the average SOC, understanding the software that's running their environment is huge. Because if you were running SolarWinds, you at least would know that had happened when the supply chain things were coming up, and you would say, okay, I need to care about this. And really, you're probably not going to hear a lot about this until something actually happens, but you need to quickly be able to understand whether you might be impacted by it or not. Understanding, again, if it's in a particular module that's underlying another technology that's being used, it might take you a little bit more time to know if that's there. But do you spend some time making sure you have your software asset inventory available to the SOC and updated on a regular basis?
Let me break that down even further. Ingrid took the words out of my mouth as usual. When the SOC is confronted with a supply chain attack, either real or suspected, there are at least 3 separate and I would argue equally independent areas they need to look. The first is, as Ingrid described, software bill of materials. What has the constituency acquired, and what are the upstream dependencies of that, from your jars to your NuGets to your whatevers, and that can be done both for acquisition channels and through code repos. That's very important, and that's usually the first place we look. I would also point out that the SOC should be leveraging its on-disk and in-memory instrumentation to look for telltale existence. There is always going to be a divergence between the code that it's running as documented through its SBOMs and through its code repos and what actually made it on the host. So it should be looking at both on-disk artifacts and, for instance, running processes. So my advice is tick all three boxes and many sub boxes of each when you're in an incident of that sort.
Right. And so the MITRE work is called the System of Trust work, and it's freely available and open. And what we advise people when you're getting started, and this really applies for a security operations organization, is you have to know what's the most important thing to you. Focus on your important assets first. When you talk about SBOMs and all that kind of stuff, software bill of materials is what an SBOM is. So it's really important to focus on your intellectual property. And we talk about that in the book very early on, about knowing what to protect, knowing why it's important, and focusing there first when you're talking about supply chain. If you create detections there, the SOC will be a little more effective, and also more likely to catch something if you're looking on what's important to you.
Yeah.
And supply chain can be really like scary, like, oh, this is happening outside my environment, and it shows up and it gets put in place. But the fact is, once they are in your environment, they have to do a lot of the same things that you would do during other types of attacks. They need to move laterally. They need to exfil information. They need to call back to a command and control server, all things that SOCs already know how to look for. And so that's why it's so important to have things across the kill chain. So you're not just looking like this is a different initial access vector, but after you get past that, a lot of the same things potentially come into play. So there are other ways you're going to be able to detect this. And so it might be later than you would like, but the SOCs are not blind to what is actually happening with this activity.
Yeah, a lot of people get wrapped up, and say like, oh, it's a trusted vendor. Like I can't do anything, right? But if you read some of those reports, like, yes, it is very clever. It is very tricky, especially, something like SolarWinds. There was a whole lot of attention paid to operational security. They were naming files and folders individually. They were using IPs in your country. But like, after you get in, right, there's still a lot of stuff that's, fairly similar to the average pen test, to the average intrusion with lateral movement and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I totally agree with Ingrid there on that one. It's like, it's not something to just throw your hands up in the air and say, I don't know anything about SBOM. I give up. This is, impossible. Certainly there are options out there for just traditional detection, right, to pick up those kinds of things. Now, if your detection goes off and says, oh, it's our SolarWinds server that happens to be, the thing that's beaconing this time, right? Those are the things where now maybe we give a little bit more consideration to like, oh, is it a supply chain attack? And having those capabilities to maybe take, DLLs apart and all that kind of stuff we see backdoored more commonly nowadays. That can be a useful thing, certainly. But yeah, it's just that's one of the things I'm always interested in is like, why are we seeing the things we're seeing in the news, right? More so than we have in the past. And so, why I asked the original question on why are we seeing more of this is I kind of think it's, and this is leading into my next question, have we raised the bar, right? Is there a significant difficulty compared to 5 years ago in breaking into an organization such that they're like, oh, I guess we have to do supply chain attacks? Like any thoughts on if that's a response to the blue team getting better?
I'm going to say something controversial. I currently believe, yeah, I know it's surprise, right? I currently believe that the surface area and complexity of supply chain attacks is progressing and expanding faster than I think our cybersecurity apparatuses are able to cope with them. Meaning, I think that deficit is increasing. And it's going to take a whole lot of work against everything from acquisition to shadow IT to enumerating what's on the box to getting our arms around, digital transformation and a bajillion other things in order to close that gap.
Yeah, I'll just add to it. I think we're, I'm kind of with Carson on this one. I think we're abstracting. We started out machine level and the operating system, and, cloud and, the VMs. And we've gotten more and more abstract, which adds more, it's just more code added on, right? So there's more vectors, there's more abilities to hide. I think that's part of what's happening. some of the sophistication. You're looking for where's the monitoring software that's really ideal to hide in, right? If you can't monitor me, I can really hide. So it's almost a damage thing. I think about video games, right? And how much damage can I cause? Well, certainly going after something like that's monitoring your network operations is a valuable asset to many organizations. So I think that's why we're seeing some of that. The good news is I think we're also talking more about it than we did in the past. We like to keep things secret. We like to keep incidents to ourselves. I think the culture has shifted over the last 5 years in particular, where companies are much more willing to share and to get information back. And we talked about that in our book as well, is sharing. When you share incident information, you'll be shocked at what comes back at you and all the help that you get and all the support. Here's what we did when we went through this very same thing. You get these unsolicited calls that you wouldn't otherwise see when you start talking about what's happening. So that's why I think you're seeing them more.
Yeah, it's hard to say, right? When some of these complex phenomena start showing up and there's so many, like, things are changing so fast on top of our, laws are modifying and everything, right? Everything is shifting all at once. It's very hard to kind of see through the mist and figure out what's truly going on in there. So that's why I'm always interested in the opinions of folks like you. What I'd love to think is that part of it, at least, is that we're getting better and they're like, oh, what's the easy way in, right? Well, not easy, but the sure way in that won't be spotted initially, right? I don't know if that's true or not. Some of the surveys seem to show that we are catching things better and faster. And so I'm hoping that's a positive kind of explanation for that sort of thing. But yeah, hard to say, right? So we only got about 3 minutes left here. I want to close up with a quick lightning round. Just overall outlook for cyber defense. Do you think we're going in a positive direction, kind of keeping pace, or do you think things are going to get harder for us, let's say in a 5-year window or something like that? Carson, let's go with you first.
It's tough to answer that. I think we all get paid to worry every day. And I worry about the surface areas expanding faster than we can keep pace with that. So I think I would pivot and take a cop-out answer and say, I think the next 5 years for all of us is going to be really spicy.
Yep. Ingrid, what about you?
I think we have the opportunity space to keep up and get better and get ahead, but I think it's going to require different skills for the people. And it's going to be, the technology is going to be important, but I think what we've been talking about today, understanding AI, understanding intelligence, understanding supply chain, understanding code, figuring out automation, all of these things are different than a SOC analyst from 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think there's going to be, I think the educational gap that we already have in terms of bringing people into the field is going to be the real challenge for us. And continuing to not only get people interested, get them in, keep them in, and then continue to advance our own skills, because it's so easy to get heads down into what you're doing. And we all need to be taking the steps back and learning what's coming next. And if we are not collectively doing that, I think there's a chance that we would fall behind.
Yeah. Kat, what about you?
Yeah, so I would say adaptability and resiliency are the two big words that I would use. Adaptability in that we need to keep learning. And we're talking giant learning curves, not just, now I learned how to do these kinds of, intelligence-based detects. No, I think we have to, shift our thinking into how do I work across the cloud and legacy environments? How do I adapt using AI? How do I use it to my benefit? And how do I try to outsmart my adversaries? Resiliency in that, I think we're going to be attacked a lot. And I think we have to be able to work through those attacks. So I think one of the biggest concepts I've seen over the last couple of years in particular, but this has been going on for a while, is resiliency, being able to operate through the attack, not having to fully bring your organization to its knees, but rather, okay, yep, we've been totally hacked. Maybe we can isolate it and keep working over here. So that's what I would say. Awesome.
I think that's a perfect kind of end on this. And, as I kind of stated going into that question, my thought is I hope things are going in a good direction, but as everything shifts and as AI, upends it all, it's going to be real hard. What I can say for sure is we are better off working with AI and staying ahead of it instead of trying to ignore it and let the attackers figure it out. We know what happens when we go against the machines. We've seen Terminator and the Matrix. It's not pretty, right? So if you are not doing prompt engineering and kind of reading up and testing out ChatGPT, at least for sure do that. That is undoubtedly a winning move, right? But adaptability and resiliency and all that kind of stuff, absolutely. I fully agree with all of that. So I think we can end it there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me for another episode.